Shocking story of one of the most powerful hurricanes ever, the natural disaster Hurricane Katrina 2005. Are you ready to be shocked as we dig into the tragic history of one of the most violent hurricanes in recorded history? Hurricane Katrina 2005. But what made Hurricane Katrina so hazardous to humanity? What impact did it have on the lives of countless people? Join us on this epic fall as we unearth the unseen facts and disturbing realities behind this horrific incident. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the United States Gulf Coast early on August 29, 2005. The storm had a Category 3 classification on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale when it made landfall, with sustained winds of 100 to 140 miles per hour and a width of 400 miles. The tropical depression that became Katrina developed over the Bahamas, and meteorologists were quickly able to warn residents of the Gulf Coast states that a significant storm was on the way. By August 28th, evacuations had begun throughout the region. That day, the National Weather Service predicted that most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer when the storm hit. New Orleans was particularly vulnerable. Despite the fact that nearly half the city is above sea level, its average elevation is around 6 feet below sea level, and it's fully surrounded by water. The Army Corps of Engineers erected a series of levees and seawalls to safeguard the city from flooding during the course of the 20th century. The levees along the Mississippi River were robust and solid, but those intended to keep Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Borgne, and the waterlogged swamps and marshes to the city's east and west at bay were far less so. Before the hurricane, officials were concerned about the surge and how it might overtop certain levees, causing short-term flooding, but no one projected that levees would fall below their planned height. Neighborhoods below sea level, many of which house the city's poorest and most vulnerable residents, were particularly vulnerable to flooding. New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin issued the city's first ever mandatory evacuation order the day before Katrina struck. He also proclaimed that the Superdome, a stadium on relatively high ground near downtown, would serve as a shelter of last resort for anyone unable to evacuate the city. By dark, about 80% of the city's inhabitants had fled. Tens of thousands of people sought shelter at the Superdome, but tens of thousands more decided to stay at home. It had already been pouring fiercely for hours when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans early Monday morning, August 29th. When the storm surge struck, it overwhelmed several of the city's shaky levees and drainage canals. Water soaked through the earth beneath some levees and washed others away entirely. Low-lying areas like St. Bernard Parish and the 9th Ward were under so much water by 9 a.m. that inhabitants had to flee to attics and rooftops for protection. Eventually, approximately 80% of the city was submerged in water. Many people performed acts of heroism in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The Coast Guard rescued around 34,000 people in New Orleans alone, and many ordinary residents commandeered boats, provided food and shelter, and otherwise assisted their neighbors. Nonetheless, the government, particularly the federal government, appeared to be unprepared for the crisis. The Federal Emergency Management Agency took days to set up operations in New Orleans and did not appear to have a solid plan of action even then. Even President George W. Bush appeared to be uninformed of how terrible things were in New Orleans and elsewhere, how many people were stranded or missing, how many houses and businesses had been wrecked, and how much food, water, and relief was required. Katrina had left a total disaster zone in her wake where people were getting absolutely desperate. Meanwhile, it was practically hard to evacuate New Orleans. Poor people, in particular who lacked transportation and had nowhere else to go, were trapped. For example, several people attempted to cross the Crescent City Connection Bridge to the adjacent community of Gretna, but were made to turn back by police officers armed with shotguns. Katrina devastated large areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, but the despair was worse in New Orleans. Prior to the hurricane, the city's population was predominantly black, and almost 30% of its residents were poor. Katrina worsened these situations, making many of New Orleans' poorest residents even more vulnerable than before the hurricane. Hurricane Katrina killed almost 2,000 people and impacted 90,000 square miles of land in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of evacuees were dispersed across the country. According to the Data Center, an independent research firm based in New Orleans, the hurricane displaced about 1 million people along the Gulf Coast. Overall, Hurricane Katrina's 2005 landfall brought catastrophic destruction, flooding, and a loss of life to Florida, Louisiana, and particularly New Orleans.